So we have two isolated populations, but they're not entirely new species yet. What are the things that are needed to make these into two new species? In this lecture, we're going to talk about divergence and how two species can come from simply two populations. I'd like you to listen to find some mechanisms of divergence. Do note that there are more in your book, and there are more examples we're not covering here as well. So you can feel free to browse more. Define ecotype and give at least one example, and relate environmental preferences to non-random mating, back to a previous lecture there, and sexual selection indeed as well. So adaptations can lead to a divergence. This is one thing that can form what's called ecotypes. There are two different ecotypes of Douglas fir, for example, one of which lives in the Pacific Northwest, west of the Cascade Mountains, and one of which is going to actually be found in the Rocky Mountains. So these two different types of Douglas fir are adapted to slightly different amounts of rainfall, very different amounts of rainfall, very different amounts of snowfall, very different amounts of wind. Here we have two examples of Mimulus guttatus. These are two ecotypes, and an ecotype is this subpopulation or population that is highly adapted to a very specific niche. So this is the inland and the coastal ecotype. The coastal ecotype has a sprawling kind of morphology and is a perennial, whereas the inland ecotype is a very quick-growing annual that is only going to last 1 year and flower very rapidly. So these are ecotypes that are each adapted to their own environments. And what happens is you're going to get these local adaptations giving them higher fitness in their niche. So local adaptations here. And these local adaptations, well, it seems to be one section of the genome that confers higher fitness either inland or on the coast. And intermediates that kind of are mixed between the two are going to be poorly adapted to either. I mean, it's kind of like you have an organism that's used to the left side of the road or the right side of the road. Parking in the middle is going to result in death. So this intermediate organism can't really survive well in either. And not only that, but transplants would fail. If you take an inland species, if an inland plant and you put it on the coast, it doesn't survive. Coastal species, put it inland, it doesn't survive. This will result in gene flow being reduced over time. This might be where you ask, well, aren't they two different species? Well, they can still interbreed and create viable fertile offspring that are viable in the lab, but not necessarily either individual biome. This is also true for a very species, I think it's sword fern. There's sword ferns east of the Cascades and west of the Cascades. They're geographically isolated from one another, and reproductive isolation may be started. So we can see three local examples where an ecotype is adapted to a specific niche. Want more? Sure. Sick of plants? Orcas. Yeah. What it's also called the killer whale. There are resident orcas and non-resident orcas. Now these are different. These are different groups. They are the same species still, but your non-resident orcas are going to be feeding on things like seals. So I remember back in the day. I don't remember what day it was. Wednesday. Anyway, there was a group of non-resident orcas that came into Puget Sound and began hunting seals. And it was just a seal bloodbath. I remember people, showing seals jumping on boats and just, get them away from me, anything to get away from the orcas. And the orcas decimated the local seal population, and then they left. And that's your non-resident orcas. You also have the resident orcas, which feed on Chinook salmon. And they're under a lot of problems right now because the Chinook salmon, they aren't as big as they used to be. And there are some invasive salmon as well, and there's pollution harming the salmon. The accumulation of rubber in the salmon is also going to accumulate in the whales. Many problems happening with the resident orca population. Whereas the non-residents, well, the seals are there or they move away. So these are different niches that the same species is going to be in. So if they were to be genetically isolated over time, you make it two different species of orcas. So long as the human species exists, we're probably just going to get one species of orca in a few generations, which will be the non-residents. That's my personal bet. Not a good one, though. But this can also lead this. Remember, adaptations are very specific to a niche. If the niche goes, so does the species. Assortative mating is another way that you can get isolation, and you can end up getting more divergence. And assortative mating can mean these different mating types become different species. So here's an example of crickets. These are Hawaiian crickets, and what happens is you can see that they have a different male song pulse rate. So how often do the chirps pulse? And we have two different species, and the two different species have very different pulse rates. Well, it turns out that you can force them to interbreed, and if you force them to interbreed, you can get a hybrid. You take that hybrid, it's viable, and you are going to back cross it to one line. So you get a hybrid that's between them, and you back cross it to the green species. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. You back cross to the green species over and over. What eventually you're going to get is you're going to get a green one that has a very long pulse rate. So a pulse rate around 4 seconds. And if you do, it's going to mate specifically with the ones with the pulse rate of 4 seconds. Because the choice and the trait, the preference and the trait, are through linked genes. And when these genes are linked, that's that linkage disequilibrium. These genes are linked, so the preference is always going to be for that same species, that same one that has the same pulse rate. So the ones that have the long pulses are going to produce males that have long pulses and females that prefer long pulses. And same with the short ones. If they have the genes for short pulses, they're going to produce males that produce short pulses and females that like short pulses, which are then going to interbreed. So the linkage of these genes kind of enforces that assortative mating in a distinct type of sexual selection. And that sexual selection, remember, is going to be on a certain trait that may or may not have to do with natural selection, but very much has to do with how much they're going to mate. So if you were to take a male that had a long pulse and put it in the population of crickets that have short pulses, he is not going to mate. And if you put a female that prefers long pulses and you put it in the population of short pulses, she's not going to choose a mate. So this is sexual selection leading to speciation. The fish example. I like this example. It's a good experimentally validated example. I do want you to check out the cricket example. It's on page 626. It's a really good one that they keep on going into the genetics of this. And if you are one of our students coming in from Hawaii, then yeah, definitely check it out. There's some really good Hawaiian speciation examples. You got the Drosophila, you got the honey creepers, you got these crickets. So some great examples of speciation. If you're one of our students in Hawaii who's taking this remotely, I don't know if we have any or not because this is before the class, but definitely give it a check. It's good stuff. All right, one fish, two fish, red fish, and blue fish. This is a problem with water and light. Blue light does not penetrate deeply in water. And I know what you're thinking, but isn't water blue? Yes, because it reflects the blue light. There we go. Okay. But wait, what about if we go down into the ocean, we see all the blue? Yes, because it scatters the blue light. Blue light does not penetrate water to a good depth. And this means that species that are colored blue, these fish that have blue reflection, they're not attractive at depth. They're just gray fish. Red fish that are red, however, are going to be just so hot down at the depths because the red light will penetrate that far and will reflect off of these fish. So that means at a deeper depth, fish can't see other blue fish, so they're just not attractive. But the red fish, oh yeah. And there's an intermediate as well, which is kind of red and blue, and I think that one's the most attractive. But then again, I'm not looking for a fish for a mate, so I'm just looking for a fish for a pet. So clearly, my opinion doesn't matter here. And the intermediates are most attractive in the intermediate depth, so you get a certain amount of blue and red, and even a little bit of yellow and green going on there. I mean, look at that fish. Isn't it neat? Okay, no, we're not getting a fish tank today. Okay, but what about muddy waters? Okay, this is the musician Muddy Waters. Okay, but muddy waters, red and blue light, both don't penetrate well. Okay, so now we've managed to eliminate all light. So do the blue fish, are they attractive? Well, they're not because they're not blue. The red fish, are they attractive? Well, they're not because they're not red. The intermediate fish, are they attractive? Well, they're not because they're not intermediate. There's a low divergence here. The females can't tell the difference between the two males. And another experiment was done with this where they put them under orange light. So your book covers this a bit, and actually your Campbell book, I believe, has a bit more on this as well. So, this is a good fish example, but, our evolution book covers this part, where they really tested the hypothesis in different waters with different amounts of murk. So the Marumbi waters, very murky. The Luanso waters, murky. Kisenda, clear. Python, clear. Makobe, clear. So we have 3 clear and 2 murky. So what we see, so what are the color phenotypes? Well, we have blue, intermediate, red class 3, and red class 4. What we see is that in Marumbi and Luanso, we see mostly intermediates. We do see some blue up at the top, but we also see intermediates, and we don't see very great depth. So that may be because Marumbi and Mulanzo don't have a great depth, or maybe just because the fish don't mate at that depth, because let's face it, if it's that muddy, you can't see anything. Predation becomes a problem there. And the female preference score in Luanzo and Marumbi was actually more for the intermediates, or for no preference. I mean, I don't care what color fish you are, you're a fish and you're here. So I guess same species, yeah. The female preference kind of went away in this Marumbi and Luanzo, whereas in this is the ones specifically, sorry. And in Python, the female preference was for either blue or red, but very few fish had no preference. And the red preferred red, and the blue preferred blue. So you see that real assortative mating going on based on the depth. And this kind of goes back to how assortative mating and sexual selection can interact with ecotypes. So here we have red fish, which are more adapted to mating at lower depths. And we have bluefish, which are more adapted to mating at higher, lesser depth, shallower. What if these red fish developed a trait that allowed them to also survive better at the depths? If they had that, you would see a further reinforcement. And what would happen there, let's say they develop the ability to do some sort of like hiding out of the bottom and ambush things from below, like a flounder. They have that ability. Well, now fish with that ability have a greater survival. If they're red, they have a greater mating. Both of these are going to lead to higher reproduction, and you would have the reinforcement by both sexual and natural selection on these bottom-dwelling red fish. And if that were to happen, then the intermediates would not only be ugly and not attract mates, but they would be ineffective and maladapted and not survive as well. And when these two reinforce one another, you can really quickly increase the divergence time. Also, what we see, though, is if there is no trait that allows greater survival and reproduction, and if there's no trait that really causes greater mating and reproduction, you can actually have the fusion back into one species. So in a later lecture, we will discuss hybrids and hybrid theories and hybridization. But for now, here we see where assortative mating by sexual selection can cause different ecotypes to slowly begin to speciate. So this feeds back on the species concepts. All right, can you check the different ecotypes? How do they diverge and become different species? I want you to look at some different examples. There are good bird examples if you're a birder. There are good mammal examples of elk, deer, and moose. I guess you can look at how those different ecotypes survive, and how can environment define whether mating preferences can evolve or not. Again, if you're from Hawaii, go check out some of these Hawaii examples of different species. Honey creepers are a really good example here. So there you have it. There's our species concepts and how different species diverge.